There is no teacher like the hammers and fists of reality. Just going to talk today about one of the first decisions that we made that was both refreshing, eventually it was refreshing, but life-changing. Some folks will say it was just words. It was words that became a core value over time. One I tried to instill in those that I worked with. That bit was hard. We'll get to those things. Also need to apologise for the different lighting. I'm a bit odd. My wife goes to town one day a week, but I do some recording then if I'm into it. The only other time I get is early in the morning before she gets out of bed and starts bustling around, and I'm not about to spend money on lighting for a little bit of an old hobby. Stories for the kids, stories I haven't told, stories of my failings. Doesn't really matter if nobody else watches. Those different lights of course come about because I watch what I've recorded and think, gee, I should put that in there and I should talk about that. What you end up with is just a rambling old man with a mess. I'm certainly not great at marketing, but if you can piece it all together, there's a story in there. Maybe a story of battling against the odds, having a bit of a win occasionally. Essentially, we're going to get to how I retired without a plan. Well, I had a plan, but that whole thing came crashing forwards. Like Mike Tyson says, it's okay to have a plan till someone punches you in the mouth. But I took a few punches in the mouth before the plan fell over. We'll get to all those things, but it's important to set it up just to show that it can be done, depending on your expectations, I guess. Of course, there's also some sound issues with multiple recordings. I find I talk differently in the morning. At times I speak more loudly than at others, so I need to use several tracks, so it becomes a pain on the edit front. It's a learning process. At times some of the stuff I say doesn't explain things properly. I've never been a good speaker. Part of the object of doing this, I'd rather write stuff down, so I'll get to redo it. And definitely not looking for sympathy, just telling a story that probably my kids need to know, but others might be interested in. I guess after the end of this 12-year period, 1980 to 1992, my life kind of resembled a couple of lines out of a 1999 song by that great Australian band Powderfinger. This life, well, it's slipping right through my hands. These days turned out nothing like I had planned. The song, of course, called These Days. I get a lot of solace out of music these days. I shy away from people, I shy away from crowds. Music and things like that is my go-to, and that's a great song, and there's much more to it. Okay, I've been off subject a little bit. Let's get back to going broke. In this one, I'm going to talk about why the high interest rates, 19-20% of the late 80s, mid to late 80s and early 90s were actually good for me and us. And it's certainly not because we had any money, had less than zero. Left secondary school in 1980. Couldn't wait to get home and be a farmer. Didn't give a lot of thought to that. There's two mistakes in that. I grew up in the era of free education. And I actually deferred an engineering course. Deferred that for 12 months. And after that 12 months, I didn't think I wanted to do engineering. And I switched it around to a Bachelor of Business. Ended up deferring that for 12 months, never getting started. So two mistakes there. One, going home to a failing enterprise. Two, not getting amongst the free education. However, there's a lot of questions there. Young, impressionable. Would I have got into the wrong sort of scene? Failed all the university courses? Don't know. Questions that can't be answered. Today, I wouldn't do either engineering or business. My interest today would lie in psychology, law, recreational spreadsheeting, economics, and I would just like to be an electrician. I don't know why. I find it a fascinating trade. I don't know how we're supposed to have 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds hogging themselves up for debts of lifetimes and deciding what they want to be way back then. But in terms of today, I'd be concerned that people that could be our best doctors and what have we are slipping through the cracks because of the sheer cost of education. University's not everything either, but that was the direction private school I attended pushed us all towards. There's plenty of good trades out there. I still say I still don't really know what I want to be. I'd often joke during my work life that I'm X years old and still don't know what I want to be. The farm was pretty rich in resources actually. They had a lot of water underneath it, some reasonable amounts of cultivation. It was only an 800 acre farm, but probably 250 acres of cultivation and 400 could have been cultivated. Looking back, without a lot of development, this was also only ever going to be a subsistence block with lots and lots of capital. It could have really been something. The operation we were in seems so minuscule compared to some of the stuff out there today, or a lot of the stuff out there today. There would have been the option to share farm some other country around the place. So a lot of water, reasonable cultivation, some creek flats. We'd gone out of dairy. I think we milked 10 to 20 cows, something like that, and separated the cream. We did run about 50 cows, and that emanated out of the dairy herd. Pigs was my big interest, but we just continued to do things in the wrong order. Coupled with the water, we had some excellent sites that would have been perfect for the development of large-scale feedlot, large-scale piggery, large-scale dairy, whatever floated your boat. So I came home from school and we borrowed some money from the Agricultural Bank. I think it might have become QIDC, Queensland Industry Development Corporation. Gee, things seemed cheap in those days, but it's all relative. We bought a travelling irrigator and sunk a couple of bores. We set that whole irrigation scheme up for just over 20 grand, and that goes the irrigator, the pipes, the engine, pump and the gear to go down the pump. But to be perfectly honest, the water was pretty shallow. It's hard to believe how small these amounts are today looking back. This is looking back from 2025. We are talking $1980 to $1990 here. The old man's dream was to grow lucerne, but again, we didn't do anything in the right orders. For some reason, the land down on this particular creek flat, some of it was awesome and some of it would go really hard really quickly. Did we get an agronomist out? No, we didn't. We just persevered on. No, we just kept doing the same thing, expecting different results. Is that not the definition of insanity? We didn't have anything to cut the lucerne. We didn't have anything to condition the lucerne. We didn't have anything to bale the lucerne. We were reliant on a contractor coming in, which doesn't really work. And the old man had done budgets for, at the time, 80 bales per acre times 20 acres times 8 cuts per year, which was top level production. We'd have been lucky to be getting 10 or 12 bales per acre and 5 cuts per year. So we're behind to start with. Similarly, on the pig side, instead of building sheds and accommodation for the breeding stock and a farrowing house, we just went and built a couple of grower sheds, had the sows breeding and farrowing outside. Of course, the old man did the budget for, at the time, top level production was 20 pigs per sow per year, 2.2 litres per sow per year. We might have been getting 1.5 litres per sow per year, and we might have been producing 12 to 15. These budget numbers would have been just something the old man had heard in conversation. He had a bit of a habit of doing that and then becoming an expert on what he'd heard without any research. Because it's very hard having sows farrowing outdoors when you haven't given any attention to those outdoor facilities. Foxes, cats, crows, wet weather, cold weather. Anyway, eventually the Commonwealth Development Bank came on board, and I'll never forget the meeting with that guy. He said, oh, well, we need to supply some money to bed down your debt with the National Australia Bank, and then we need to get a farrowing and weaning shed built. So we did all that. And yes, we were saving more pigs once we could control the birthing process and the temperature. That's all different today as well. You can't use those types of facilities anymore. And we really needed more controllable housing for the breeding stock. We borrowed $50,000 at one stage to build a shed for those breeding stock. The old man spent it on other stuff, paid some fuel bills. Don't even know what he spent the rest of it on, to be honest, but it disappeared and we didn't build a shed. And I was definitely part of the problem. Definitely part of the problem here. One of the things I should have done if I was going to neglect university was go and work for somebody else. We had some really good pig operations in our area, and it would have been beneficial to do that or go off to Queensland Agricultural College at Gatton and do something in that discipline there. So I completely failed myself in that area. Work didn't worry me. I never took a wage for the 12 years I was at home. I never took any money out of the place. So I'd do what I needed to do during the day, and then I'd go driving tractors around the district at night time. I've been driving tractors around the district since I was 11. As you'll see, as time goes on and I get to telling the whole story, long days, long weeks, big hours didn't bother me. Certainly not the answer. I wouldn't advise it for anyone because there's better ways to make a living, better, smarter ways to make a living, better, smarter ways to operate your life. I'm certainly not giving anyone advice. This is just my story. I actually become my own worst enemy over time, and that'll be an unfolding theme. So that carried on, and we just weren't making any money, and until I got hold of some of the budgeting numbers, I don't know, it'd have been 85 or 86, I'd have been home 5 or 6 years I suppose, and I could see that putting the old man's budget numbers versus actuals, we were in some real trouble here, real trouble. And it was at that time that I suggested, or started suggesting to the old man and the old woman, we're screwed here, we probably should sell up, because we couldn't borrow any more money, and my mother would keep saying, oh, they didn't give us enough money. You know, my mother went to her grave still being bitter with information that was incorrect. Right to the very end, my wife rang my mother for her birthday the day before she died, and she told my wife she'd written a letter to her brother, who was quite well to do, had ended up selling quite a bit of rural land bordering a town that had really ripped up in value. Her father's will left that to him. My mother's father bought my parents a house. That, in his eyes, evened everything up, and that was mentioned in the will that that was all said and done for my mother and grandparents. She told my wife she'd written him a letter demanding some of the millions that he'd made from said land sales. She had $500,000 of her own from her house sitting in the bank that my sister wasn't allowing her to use. And here's another story in itself. For the record, we received none of this. Consequences of times past, but none of our expectations were ever based around inheritances. There was no understanding that if we borrowed 100,000, it would have been a good policy to have maybe another 100k in cash to put with it, for example. But we continued to borrow all this money. The old man always used to say things like, oh, they don't want the money back, they only want the interest. Unfortunately, they saw it differently. Then we started not paying any of that money off. The old man started another bank account, so it just left these debts fester and continue to grow. So I'm actually thankful that the interest rates were 19 and 20% as we headed into the last of that period, because it accelerated the process. It really ripped that debt up, and the bank that actually ended up selling us up was a National Australia Bank. Not having a go at them, they did what they needed to do, and I wish they'd done it earlier. They weren't the first mortgage holder. I think the QIDC held first mortgage. National Australia Bank came second, and the Commonwealth Development Bank came third. Commonwealth Development Bank would have got nothing. Looking back, had we survived longer, there were some big downturns, particularly in the pig game, that we probably wouldn't have survived, wouldn't have been big enough as enterprises sprung up and grew around the country. Of course, as I got older, it had been more and more difficult to find work as a completely unskilled person. Wasn't going to make any difference to the old man. He wasn't never going to work. There was a time he was looking at international or foreign currency loans. I didn't know enough about exchange rates and things like that back then. Looking back now that I do, though, I'm really glad we never went down that path. That would have just exacerbated things. Or perhaps it would have sped the process up just a little bit more. Could have been good, don't know. The old man and I went to Kingaroy one day and we met out the back of someone's farm. This visit to Kingaroy was where the foreign currency loan thoughts came about. I think the ANZ was pushing them most overtly back at that time. These guys were a little bit scary. They talking about armed sieges on banks, and I'm glad we got out of that. And since those days, of course, I've done a fair bit on currencies and markets. You don't really want to get into something that's semi-complex that you don't know anything about today. Very valid tool. The old man was also got involved with some pretty dodgy real estate agents, and it wasn't until several years after I understood what they were proposing. They had a group of people that had sapphires and emeralds and what have we that were valued at $500,000-$600,000. Who knows what you'd get for them. So we'd go bankrupt, they'd throw in $150,000 cash, and we'd get these stones valued at $500,000. Also glad we didn't go down that line. I think one of those guys ended up in jail not too long after our event. We were running some 90-day bank bills there at one stage, and the idea was you just take out a couple of $50,000 90-day bills, roll them over and pay the interest at that 90-day period. Didn't work real well either. It's never going to work when you haven't got the money to pay the interest on the bills you're rolling over. In there somewhere, mid-80s, the old man decided he might try and get voted on the council. That took him out pretty much full-time, driving around talking to people, doing whatever councillors do. So I had to give up my night-time work. I didn't have any time left for that, but that cut off the money flow as well for me personally. Then the old man decided that we'd try and sell the pigs at an auction in Toowoomba. Elders who we were using took out an ad in the paper, and the bank was all over that. So they took all the money from that. We sent 500-600 pigs down here for an auction. Didn't get a cent out of that. We were already owed the feed company $50,000-$60,000. We were in deep trouble. Fortunately, my grandfather paid that. Never got a cent back for that. And it was coming time for me to make some decisions. Of course, mortgagee auction, it was sold pretty cheap. That piece of dirt today would be worth, I don't know, maybe $3 or $4 million with that water. But anyway, we couldn't hold it given the situation we were in. My parents wanted to go bankrupt. That was martyrdom. And even at my old man's funeral, the bloke that did the eulogy, these people were put through terrible time by the banks. Banks, well, I thought they were pretty nice, actually. A really odd situation. There was 2 houses on the place. My parents had built a new house, and then there was my grandmother's house where my wife and I were living. 2, almost 3 kids at the time I was selling up. My wife and I started living in a caravan after we got married, and we moved into my grandmother's house after she passed in late 1988. But my grandparents, all those years ago, must have had some inkling that they were going to go broke, which is not a good way to start, because it was a good little piece of legal work. They had some sort of a lease agreement drawn up that in perpetuity, that house that my grandmother lived in and 2 acres would always be available for her or whoever was living in it to stay in it, along with access. This lease remained in perpetuity while ever someone was living in that house on that block. I think the lease cost $50 a year to maintain. Don't really remember those details. So of course my parents moved in with us. Things went downhill fairly quickly from there. You got no idea how awkward it is with the new owner living 80 metres away and you're occupying this piece of land. My parents went away, I'm not sure why, and they went away for several weeks. Maybe it was the time the old man had quadruple bypass. Not sure. And it was in that time that we made a decision to draw a line in the sand, take responsibility, particularly me. My wife got dragged into this mess. She could have married much better, and I keep telling her that. That's one thing I agree with my mother-in-law on. So draw a line in the sand, take responsibility for where I'm at, cast aside all the demons, and whose fault is it, what have we? Move on, move out. To this responsibility thing, and it's easy to say words like responsibility, but in this particular case, it involved cutting my parents out of my life. That took place for a very long time, but I needed to remove all of those negative influences from my life, but also making sure that the kids had access to their grandparents. So that just put more pressure on my wife, I guess. We were just very bad at all the things we were trying to do. There's a couple of lessons in there for me. Just because you're operating an enterprise or decide to operate an enterprise doesn't give you any rights of survival or guarantee of success. Even really good operations collapse at times for many reasons. Accepting that I and I alone was responsible for the situation that we were in. It was more than just me. It was a few of us. And we made a pact that we weren't going to be too worried about where we ended up, and that it was all about ensuring that the kids had a better launching pad than we did. This responsibility thing and taking responsibility actually became a central tenet, core value in my particular life as I moved through the years in the workforce. It's served me very well. And while this is my story and I'm not here to give advice, just taking responsibility for the circumstances and the situation for us was a pretty good place to start. I didn't really want to go bankrupt at 29. It was hard enough finding a job as it was back in those days with the poor skill set that I had. I didn't have much to offer. Work ethic was about it. I had no skills, low self-confidence, no hope basically, no real world skills anyway. Had an education, a bit of basics in maths, maybe an inquiring mind, maybe that came later. So while my parents were, I got on the phone, talked to the banks, negotiated a no bankruptcy, that what they had received they would accept as full and final payment. A little bit of toing and froing on where that was going. We left a bit of money on the table. My wife keeps chipping me about it today. I think from the rural adjustment scheme I could have taken $20,000 plus something to live on for 3 months or something like that. I declined that because one of my questions to them was, will you be able to take that back in the future? And my understanding from that conversation was that yes, they would be able to. So I left that. Doesn't sound much, but that $20,000 would have been 50% of a house in Dalby at that time, 25% of a house, perhaps maybe 20% of a house here in Toowoomba, so reasonable deposit and fortnightly payment similar to unemployment benefits. The median price of a house in Sydney in 1992, which was the time frame we're talking, was $220,000 according to the 3Ws. Couldn't find a median price for Toowoomba, but houses in the upper echelon areas were selling for $100,000, $120,000. Average earnings were about $590 a week, with a minimum wage of $6.59. So if you put all that into context of a $20,000 grant, it wasn't too bad. But when I look back, and I'm not just looking back today, when I look back over the next ensuing years, it was a pretty good process, pretty good learning process, negotiation, what the banks will and won't accept given the situation was dire. There was no chance we were ever going to pay that back. It was going to increase faster than we'd pay it back. Bankruptcy was a silly option. Anyway, after I got the banks and everything under control, which made my parents really angry because they wanted to go bankrupt, they wanted to be able to say, look at us, we've gone bankrupt, what those terrible people have done to us. I found the banks quite amicable to deal with, no dramas at all. So my wife had some savings, so we went to draw that down, and we did draw that down. After I finished with the banks, I got on the phone, got myself a job, and my wife organised a place to rent in town, and all this happened while my parents were away. Just packed up and left and moved into town. So and that job, strangely enough, was in the feed mill of definitely the biggest piggery in Queensland at the time, owned by a guy by the name of Brian Hayward, on a place called Tong Park, that I'd have a couple of things to do with over the next 30 years. The last guy that I worked for, along with two partners, they were known as the CHM Group, Cameron's, Halls, McLean's, also known as Three Aussie Farmers, ended up owning Tong Park after Brian Hayward had sold it to Mitsubishi, who spent about $80 million there and went broke and sold it to the guy I finished up working for and his partners through PIC Australia and Sunpool Fresh Foods for about $3 million plus stock. So that's, well, I think it's a 9,000 sow piggery there now. So I got a job in the feed mill there, run at the time by a little Scotsman with a red goatee. I always wanted a red beard, and all I got was this white thing. I blamed the chemo, and they ran a bus from Dalby, which was good. I could walk down to the Shell service station, catch the bus back into town, and then just walk home. I think it was about 3 kilometres home. I did one day out there. We got out there, and you walked in the shed and you couldn't see for dust. Occasionally there'd be a sparking of electrical cords. A couple of blokes just lay under a silo, had a sleep, drank a bit of alcohol. One bloke seemed to be on the Kahlua and milk. So I got home that day and I said to my wife, I can't go back. My first lesson in safety in reality. The safety was also interesting. It was something I made one of my specialties over the next 30 years, and to this day, from what I've seen in other workplaces, I did it a lot differently, and I had a great deal of success with the way I moved safety through the workplace. So I rang the manager and said, mate, I can't come back. You can have that day for free. That was the other thing. The head operator in the feed mill was, we've got all these bins. He said, we just make the creep and we put it in that bin, then we make the wiener and we put it on top of that and we go into the next bin. We just keep going into bin after bin. This is shit show. Can't do this. You should never mix feeds like that. Heaps of issues there. Drugs in the small pigs feed. Who knows where what ended up. Different specifications of feed. That was just a recipe for disaster. I've heard of commercial feed mills mixing feed like this, which is really bad and so easy to stop happening. I didn't go back there, obviously. I just found that too dangerous a place to be, with not a lot of management going on at all. So you thought it would have been bad going broke and getting sold up? Well, it gets a little worse than that. From there, we had run out of savings. My wife was very pregnant with our third child, and I had to humble up and accept some unemployment benefits while I found something. I definitely think this was my lowest moment. I don't know, I might have something ahead of me yet that's lower, but we'll see. And I think I was on unemployment benefits for maybe 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks. It wasn't long. But in that time, it was required that I do a course, and I went along and did this computer course, and it reignited my love for this computing game, and particularly at that time the course was on spreadsheeting, and later as it all relates to all things automation. And of course today AI would love to still be in the workplace using some AI, not to displace people because we could never find enough people, but to do some of that jobs that would allow people to do higher value things. A couple of things come to mind that would free up 10 to 15 hours per week for one person, and another application that would very much decrease the stress from a scheduling point of view. And I had done a little bit in my own time on spreadsheeting. They all thought, gee, this bloke's smart. Well, I wasn't really. It was still pretty basic. They were at a really low level. So we actually helped the course coordinators teach the basics of was Lotus 1, 2, 3 in those days. And I eventually got a job at a local feedlot, and that job was cleaning troughs to start. So I think that was a 3-day-a-week job. And I'd head out and walk around amongst the cattle with my long piece of hose. I hooked the hose up, drained the water out into a drain, cleaned the trough out, talked to the cattle, and I found I quite enjoyed that. No people, just the cattle and I, and that was 3 days a week. So I turned the trough cleaning into 2 days worth of hours across 3 days. It needed to be done across 3 days, and I did that by packing my lunch and some water in a backpack, and when it became lunchtime, never have stuff for Smogo. When it became lunchtime, rather than spend 15 minutes walking back up to the shed, I just have lunch wherever I was, down the paddock with the cattle, which essentially saved half an hour a day. Well, I suppose I was supposed to go back up for Smoko too, so it's another hour a day. Just canned all that and saved a heap of time, which allowed me to be asked to do other things around the feedlot. Small introduction to efficiency, I guess, which I made my own over the years, was one of my big catch cries. And then it turned out the feedlot was having trouble finding people, so I ended up doing the troughs and cleaning pens, and they couldn't find anyone either to sieve the manure, so I'd go out on the weekends and sieve manure for 10 hours a day. And I ended up doing some in the feed mill as well, and some on the grain receivals. I did a bit of landscaping too at this particular feedlot. Not sure that landscaping is probably the correct term. I planted grass on a hill. The feedlot expanded and they had a bit of an angled hill, so we planted a heap of grass on that hill to stop the water washing the hill embankment away. Was the reason we were planting said grass. message is I just got in and did what I was asked. There's a bit of a theme developing already, and that theme is doing work that no one else wants to. I didn't believe I had any real ability to be choosy in what jobs I took. I was getting paid $10 an hour, casual, no overtime rates, just plenty of hours. I didn't know enough about any of those things after getting off the farm. So I was working 7 days a week there, which was fine. The money was handy as we started to try and rebuild life. That was the only time I had ever received unemployment benefits, and to be perfectly honest, I couldn't wait to get off them. We did get the whatever the child endowment benefits were back in those days. Every cent of that went to their education, their books, whatever we needed. There's no big screen TVs in our place. I couldn't wait to get off that either, and that required getting to an income level, making a sum of money that disqualified you from receiving this stuff. Anyway, that's another part of the story, but in that particular zone we reached the lowest part of my life. I think that was pretty, what would the word be? Humiliating is not the right word, but it was a low part of life, particularly now I'm dragging my wife and kids through something that they didn't make a conscious choice to be part of. I guess some people would say when I get cancer a few years later, that would have been the lowest part of my life. I disagree. Cancer to me was just another one of the many challenges of life, another win-lose situation, and for me, one of 4 life-changing events. I appreciate cancer's a very individual journey, and again, there's no advice on how to handle it. For me, whether I won the battle or lost the battle, it was actually good for me. Made some changes in those early parts of the cancer journey that benefited me greatly. Not saying I held on to those changes either though. But the old man didn't stop there. After we'd moved out, he started writing letters, and I didn't find this out till almost 10 years after he died, when we had to move my mother out of her house. She just became a little bit incapacitated, and some of the stuff from her house came here, and I got all the boxes of documents, and I was going through them one day, and there were hundreds of letters he was writing, several a day, to bank executives, bankers, lawyers, real estate agents involved, and they all had one underlying theme, that he was accusing them of all being in cohorts with one or the other to reduce the price of what we got to get us off. Just a whole bunch of shit, and he wrote them on these carbon books so I could read them all. Unfortunately, I felt a little bit embarrassed even all this time after it. Got them all shredded and put them in the bin. Right now I wish I just pushed them aside a little bit and held them for some future reference, but that was a real eye-opener. After I read those letters, I reckon we were very lucky that the bank didn't reverse that bankruptcy decision, and the old man was probably also very lucky that someone didn't take him on for something else. They were pretty ugly. We've got to the bit where I broke beyond comprehension, or found a job, but I didn't stay there long. Yep, and look, I'm probably a bit behind. I'm 29. The next 10 years provided some of the best education I've had. I'm going to tell those stories, and if it helps one person, that's great. Certainly none of it is advice, and none of it is, I did this, you should do this, because I've done a lot wrong and still managed to be in a fortunate situation today. But I sold my soul to the devil at least twice over time. Just to clarify that, I'm in no way religious, but I sold my soul. So when I go to hell, I sure hope I burn well. I guess what I'm saying is, you have got time. There are avenues, and there's far too many negative people out there in the world today. So to anyone who's made it this far, as you would have seen, there's lots of different edits recorded at lots of different times. I've just tried to take away any ambiguity in the facts, because we're not actually having a face-to-face conversation. Just in case a number of people watch it, it's not easy when you're not just having a conversation, and you can correct ambiguities, not necessarily facts. The facts are right, but you can correct ambiguities as you go along. Anyway, we'll see how we go.